I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We are continuing this evening with our summer series of questions and answers that have been given to me by our class that is attending, as well as some questions that I have come up with when I don't have those questions. However, tonight we are going to be in Isaiah chapter 65. We're going to be talking about the new heavens and the new earth. And as I look over the material, this may not be a 1 week thing. It's maybe a more than 1 week question, because there is a lot to cover. And the way I'm going to cover this is we're going to take a look at Isaiah. And we are going to look at what Isaiah was talking about. And then after that, we're going to look at the New Testament usage of the same phrase, new heavens and new earth, to see why the phrase is used and what it could be talking about. So if we're in Isaiah 65, we need to know that Isaiah 64, the chapter comes before it, records the prophet Isaiah calling for God to break into history as he did at Sinai, so that the darkened hearts of Israel would return to the Lord. Presently, Isaiah observes that the land is a desolation because of their sinfulness, and God's righteous judgment has fallen on them. But this separation, because of their sins, has caused the people to run further from God rather than back to him. After Isaiah has prayed for the Lord to act, Isaiah 65 and 66 records God's answer, which describes what he is going to do to his sinful creation. And so, when we look at Isaiah 65, we're going to just begin to see the great things that God has said he will do. So let's read the first 12 verses of Isaiah 65. There are 4 of us, so let's read 3 verses each. We'll start with Naomi, go back to Tammy, and around. Isaiah 65, 1 to 12.
I was ready to be sought by those who did not ask for me. I was ready to be found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am, to a nation that was not called by my name. I spread out my hands all the day to a rebellious people who walk in a way that is not good, following their own devices. A people who provoke me to my face continually, sacrificing in gardens and making offerings on bricks.
Who sit among the graves and spend the night in trees, who eat swine's flesh and the broth of abominable things in their vessels. Who say, think to yourself, do not come near me, for I am holier than you. These are smoke in my nostrils, the fire that burns all the day. Behold, it is written before me, I will not keep silence, but will repay, even repay the accuser.
Your iniquities and the iniquities of your fathers together, says the Lord, who have burned incense on the mountains and blasphemed me on the hills. Therefore I will measure their former work into their reason. Thus says the Lord, as the new wine is found in the cluster, and was when one says do not destroy it, for a blessing is in it, so will I do for my servant's sake, that I may not destroy them all. I will bring forth descendants from Jacob, from Judah, an heir of my mouth. My elect shall inherit it, and my servant shall dwell there.
Sarah shall be a fold of the flocks, and the valley of the anchor a place for birds to lie down, and my people will have shelter. And you are those who forsake the Lord, who forget my holy mountain, who prepare the table for God, and who furnish a drink offering to men. Therefore I will number you for the sword, and you shall all bow down to his marbles, because when I called you, you did not answer. When I spoke, you did not hear. Did evil before my eyes, and chose what that in which I did not deny it.
So God begins his answer to Isaiah by declaring that he is ready to be sought after by those who did not seek him or did not ask for him. Who should have come and sought God? Who should have? In the Old Testament. Israelites should have. But remember, they've turned away from God and they refused to return. So who could we possibly be talking about? In the Old Testament, Isaiah is prophesying about something, or God's saying something that's going to happen in the future. Who could we? We're not determined there yet, but who could we be talking about? The Gentiles. We could be talking about this people that God, those who did not seek him or ask for him. Think about it. The Gentiles didn't ask for Christ to come and die for them on the cross. They didn't think they needed it. The Jews didn't think they needed it either. But they were the ones who had the prophecies of God. They were the ones who knew about God, should have sought him, should have asked for his blessings, and did not. And so God says he will now call a nation that was not called by his own name. God's first answer is that he is going to avail himself to these Gentiles. The people not called by his own name, and he did not seek after him, God will now tell them, here I am. Here I am. That's what he said in verse 1. The Apostle Paul quotes this statement. Naomi, you want to get Romans 10, verse 20.
Then Isaiah is so bold as to say, I have found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me.
We know Isaiah 65 is talking about the Gentiles because Paul, through the Holy Spirit, tells us that Isaiah 65 is talking about the Gentiles. We do not have to wonder about that. And in fact, we find that the inclusion of the Gentiles was always part of God's plan. And if we would have read in other places in Isaiah, like Isaiah 60 verse 10, we would have seen where God says he will raise his banner to the nations. God will no longer only reveal himself to Israel, but also to the nations who are not seeking him. Now, when God reveals himself to the nations, does that mean that he has cast Israel aside? Think about verse 2. Has God completely rejected Israel? No. Why not? According to Isaiah 65 verse 2. He stretches out his hands all day long to a rebellious people. And so this would tell us that in saving the Gentiles, God was not going to say Israel cannot be saved. And that's a point that Israel needed to hear, and that's a point the Gentiles need to hear. If you're still in Romans 10, you want to get verse 21.
But of Israel he says, all day long I have held out my hands to disobedient and contrary people.
Same thing. Paul is saying, Isaiah 65 verse 1, talking about the Gentiles. Isaiah 65 verse 2, talking about Israel. And so Israel has become the rebellious people, just as Isaiah has also observed. But God then reviews his dealings with Israel from verses 2 to 7 of Isaiah 65. God held out his hands, a call for his people to return to him. But they were rebellious and obstinate. They decided to walk in the way that is not good, rather than walk according to God's way. They decided to follow their own plans. They pursued their own thoughts and desires. The people of Israel continually provoked God to his face and went after idols. They rejected God's law and ate foods that were not clean. We talked about, verse 4 talks about eating swine's flesh. They were not allowed to eat that. And of course, they got themselves involved in other pagan practices. Yet, as they reject the ways of the Lord and walk according to their own paths, they think that they were still holy. That's what verse 5 says. Keep yourself, do not come near me, for I am holier than you. These are smoke to my nostrils, a fire that burns all day long. We are to view ourselves as saved sinners. In other words, not that we are not righteous today, but we are righteous today by God's grace. We are not righteous today based on our own goodness or our own moral superiority. We are saved by God's grace. But the people of Israel looked at their own actions and considered themselves good and holy, and God saying, no, you're not. Verse 6 of Isaiah 65, the people's sins were written before God. Their sinful acts are recorded in the book before him, and God will judge them for their sins. God will repay in full for their sinful behavior. Why? What does verse 7 say at the end? Why? What had they done to God? They blasphemed. They deserved the punishment for those sins. They blasphemed him on the hills. But our gracious God will not bring this nation to total destruction. Verses 8 to 10 says that God would bring a remnant that will remain. God will not destroy all of them. There will be a reversal that will occur as the desolation will be changed to pastures from the western borders to the eastern borders. That's Sharon to the Valley of Achor. Before speaking about this reversal, though, God speaks of his own vindication for this judgment. The people have forsaken the Lord. Rather than trusting in the Lord, they trusted in pagan gods. They trusted in luck or fate. So God will show them their fate. They are doomed for judgment because when God called, they did not answer and did not listen. They chose not to do what the Lord delights in. And you might say, well, where is this going with new heavens and new earth? It's the introduction to this promise. Let's read verses 13 to 16. We'll let Tammy get Isaiah 65, 13 to 16.
Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, my servant shall eat, but you shall be hungry. Behold, my servant shall drink, but you shall be thirsty. Behold, my servant shall rejoice, but you shall be ashamed. Behold, my servant shall sing for joy in heart, but you shall cry for sorrow in heart, and weep for grievous spirit. You shall leave your name as a curse to my choosing, for the Lord God will slay you, and call his servants by another name, so that he who blesses himself in the earth shall bless himself in the God of truth, and he who swears in the earth shall swear by the God of truth, because the former troubles are forgotten, and because they are hidden from my eyes.
Okay. So, who are God's contrasting two groups. Who is he contrasting here? All right, the faithful and the unfaithful. How are the faithful described? As his servants. So we have God's servants are being contrasted to those who are not God's servants. What's the contrast going to be? Yeah. Now, are we necessarily talking always about physical blessings? Bill's shaking his head no. You remember on the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, they shall be filled. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. All of those things, Jesus, you could come back here and sort of see, even though Jesus is not quoting Isaiah 65, you can sort of see the comparisons here. His servants shall eat, you, not God's servants, will be hungry. His servants will drink, you, not God's servants, will be thirsty. His servants shall rejoice, you, not God's servants, are going to be ashamed. And so God is contrasting his people, his servants, to not his servants. So if we listen and obey, you're going to experience the life that God desires you to have. Follow his ways and enjoy the riches that are found in God. This is, again, not talking about physical blessings. God does bless us physically, but that is not the idea that God is presenting here in Isaiah 65. These are spiritual blessings. Keep that in mind. That when we talk about God's servants in the future, we're talking about spiritual blessings. Now we come to verse 17 through verse 25 and get this idea of new heavens and new earth. Let's see, that's 8 verses. We'll do 2 verses each, 17 through 25. We'll start with Bill.
For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and foreigners shall not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I have created. For behold, I create Jerusalem as a rejoicer, as her people is joy. I will rejoice in Jerusalem, and joy in my people. The voice of weeping shall no longer be heard, nor the voice of crying.
No more shall an infant from their Nile but a few days. Nor an old man who has not fulfilled his days, for a child shall die 100 years old, but a sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed. They shall build house and inhabit them. They shall plant the vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For as the days of a tree, they shall be the days of my people, and my elect shall none enjoy work of their hand.
They shall not labor in vain or bear children for calamity, for they shall be the offspring of the blessed of the Lord, and their descendants with them. Before they call, I will answer. While they are yet speaking, I will hear.
The wolf and the lamb shall feed together, the lion shall eat straw like the ox, thus shall be the serpent's feet. They shall not hurt nor destroy, and all my holy mountain serve God.
Okay. Verse 16 is very important to observe, since verse 17 is an explanation of God's prior declaration. God said in verse 16 that there was going to be a reversal. God said that there was going to be a change. His people were going to be called by another name. We see that in the New Testament. Bill, you want to get Revelation chapter 2, verse 17, and Henry, Revelation chapter 3, verse 12. His people are going to be called by another name. Revelation 2, verse 17.
He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat. And I will give him a white stone, and on the stone a new name, written which no one knows except him who receives it.
Okay, and Revelation 3, verse 12.
He who overcomes will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. And he shall build house in the right, containing the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of the heaven from my God, and will write on him my new name.
Okay. Now, book of Revelation, remember, about things that will shortly come to pass. The beginning of Revelation, first 3 chapters, talking about the 7 churches of Asia and what would happen to them. Yet here in these 2 passages, I forget which churches are being addressed here, but Jesus is telling them that they are going to get a new name. A new name. A name that is different than Israel. We might call that Christians, sons of God, children of God. These are the ideas that we're talking about. But here back in Isaiah 65, God's saying he's going to call his people by another name. They will be blessed of God, by the God of truth, because former troubles are forgotten and are hidden from God's eyes. God is able to set aside the former sins and troubles so that they no longer will come into reckoning. Now, why would that be possible? It wasn't possible in Isaiah 65. As far as before Isaiah 65, it wasn't possible. What could we be talking about?
I think it's going to be a new system. Former Mosaic, the one we're living under, it's going to change.
Okay, it's going to change. So that's good. Idea of the law of Moses is going to change. What's going to be different about what this change is going to bring in?
Former is going to be no more remembered.
The former is going to be no more remembered. Former troubles are forgotten because they're hidden from my eyes. How is that going to be possible? Something has to happen that the law of Moses couldn't deal with. New law, which was ushered in by what? Christ and his death on the cross. That's how sin was going to be able to be forgotten and hidden from God's eyes. That's where we start in verse 17. God is going to create a new heavens and a new earth, and the former things will not be remembered and come into mind. So a radical change is pictured so that the former ways will not come to mind again. Does anyone know how the Hebrews viewed the heavens? We sort of get that in the New Testament. How many heavens did they believe in? 3. So what do we have for the first heavens? Sky. Second heavens? Yeah, what we would call outer space today. Third heavens? That's where God lives. We saw that in 2 Corinthians, when Paul was caught up into the third heavens. We get that sort of in Genesis chapter 1 when we talk about the heavens. The heavens were without form and void, or the earth was without form and void. And when we see God creating the heavens and the earth, well, why is heavens plural there? So in the Hebrew mind, we're thinking of sky. So what would be the old heavens and the old earth to a Hebrew mind? All right, that could be represented by the Mosaic law. But could it also be represented by something else? Tabernacle, or just even this heavens, this earth. And so I believe you're closer on the Mosaic law. Maybe that's how it's being used here when we talk about a radical change. But even in the sense of old heavens, old earth, if these heavens and this earth was changed, how big of a change would that be? If this was all gone. Yeah. For us, we don't know anything different. Maybe to the Hebrew under the law of Moses, they didn't know anything different than the law of Moses. People in Isaiah's day didn't experience Mount Sinai. That was 700 years before. They had always lived under the law of Moses, thought it was going to be forever. And yet God's saying here, no, I'm going to create a new heavens and a new earth. The former things are not going to be remembered or come to mind. A radical change is pictured. The former things must include the former troubles that we read about in verse 16, which are a summary of the troubles that were involved in verses 2 to 12. God says there's going to be total renewal, and that all that came before is going to be forgotten. God will create a new order, which include a new heavens and a new earth. The imagery that God goes on to use in what comes after shows a dramatic reversal. Now, what does it say God will create in verse 19? And what will that bring with it? Yeah, 65. Sorry, verse 18. Sorry, 18 and 19. So he's going to create Jerusalem. And it's going to be a place of rejoicing. When Isaiah prophesied this, Jerusalem was still standing. The city of Jerusalem was still standing. Israel hadn't even gone off into Assyrian captivity yet. Isaiah was around the time of Hezekiah, which was around that time when Israel will go off into captivity. So when God says, I'm going to create a new Jerusalem, I'm going to create Jerusalem, to a Jewish mind or a Hebrew mind at that time, you're like, whoa, hold on a second. This has changed. Because Jerusalem already stands, it exists. We must not be talking about that. There's going to be joy and gladness. They will not be a people who cause the Lord to grieve. God will now rejoice in his people. They will not be brought under distress for their sinful ways. Verse 20 describes something that's amazing. What does it say in verse 20? See what we say. No more shall an infant from there live but a few days, nor an old man who has fulfilled his days. For the child shall die 100 years old, but the sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed. When we talk about God's servants, what's being talked about there? Got to sort of see into it. When it refers to death, what's changed? An infant, no more shall an infant live but a few days. The power of death that we have over mankind. Power of death is going to be brought under control. And we'll discuss why that is maybe in a little bit. But we can't read this as a physical fulfillment, as far as something in this physical life here in Isaiah. Because, do children still die today and old men die? Yeah, they do. And that's why people have a hard time with this section. They say, well, it must be somewhere in the future. Forgetting what we've talked about. New heavens and new earth, new Jerusalem. Power of death is going to be destroyed. And furthermore, verses 21 and 22, the covenant curses from Deuteronomy 28 are going to be removed. God is pronouncing the curses for disobedience and sinful living. Well, let's go back to Deuteronomy 28 and verse 30 and then compare it to Isaiah and to what we've read. Deuteronomy 28 verse 30 says, you shall build a house, but you shall not dwell in it. You shall plant a vineyard, but you shall not enjoy its fruit. This is what would happen to Israel had they been disobedient. Verse 21 of Isaiah 65, they shall build houses and inhabit them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. God's removing these curses here in Isaiah 65. The people will no longer be uprooted because of their sins, and God will not have to do this anymore. And God promised this earlier in Isaiah. But if we go back to Isaiah, I'll get Naomi to read this. Isaiah 62, verses 8 and 9. Isaiah 62, verses 8 and 9.
The Lord has sworn by his right hand, by his almighty arm, I will not again give your grain to be food for your enemies, and foreigners shall not drink your wine for which you have labored. But those who garner it shall eat it and praise the Lord, and those who gather it shall drink it in the courts of my sanctuary. Okay. We have to remember, this is the Hebrews are the ones reading this. They know Deuteronomy.
They know the curses are going to come because of their disobedience. But God's saying in this new heavens, new earth that's going to be in the future, his servants, his people are not going to experience this. Again, we have to keep that in mind when it comes to a spiritual fulfillment. God will hear prayers even before they're praying and will answer while they're speaking. Things will be so different. What does verse 25 of Isaiah 65 say? Isaiah 65. What's it say? Between the wolf and the lamb. Has that happened in the old heavens, old earth? Well, the wolves usually eat the lambs, but they don't eat together. The lion's going to eat straw like the ox. Lion usually would eat something like an ox, even though it might not eat an ox. Dust shall be the serpent's food. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain. Things are going to be different in the new world that God said, that's God making. It's going to be a total change. Further, the dust shall be the serpent's food. This imagery comes from Genesis 3:15, where we read about the offspring of woman crushing the head of the serpent. For the serpent to eat dust for food means the serpent, which the Bible constantly represents with Satan, has been defeated and God's people are victorious. This is seen as in the powerful finale of the chapter, they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, says the Lord. Now, we must stop for a moment and ask ourselves, what is God describing? Is he describing that in eternity he will create a new heaven and a new earth, and all of God's people will live on this perfect earth with God? Is that what he's saying? This is what people often think he's saying in Isaiah 65. And the primary reason for that is because what is described in the latter half of Isaiah 65 after verses 17 through 25 hasn't been seen today. It's argued that the wolf and the lamb do not graze together, and the lion does not eat grass like the ox. Further, infants still die, and people do not necessarily live long lives. And then people go to Revelation 21, which describes a new heaven and new earth after the final judgment of Revelation 20, and therefore come away saying the new heavens and new earth are pictures of eternity here on the earth, and that's what Isaiah 65 must be talking about. However, to start to look for a literal fulfillment of these images would miss everything that Isaiah has done throughout his book. And us not having studied Isaiah in full, we sort of do miss some of that. But if we would have studied Isaiah, we would see all the way along Isaiah is using physical imagery to speak of spiritual realities. Tammy, you want to get Isaiah 55, verses 12 and 13. 55, yes. Isaiah 55, 12 and 13.
For you shall go out with joy and be led out with peace. The mountains of the hills shall break forth in the city before you, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress tree, and instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle tree. It shall be to the Lord for a name, for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off.
The point I want to make from these passages is the imagery we see in Isaiah. The mountains and the hills are going to sing for us, and the trees will clap hands for us. Do we see that today? Is that literally what Isaiah is talking about? Mountains and hills, do they sing? No. Do trees clap hands? We say trees don't have hands. And so, Isaiah 55, does that mean, since these things don't happen, that Isaiah 55 has not happened because we still have thorns in our plants and we still have these other things? Are we actually rebuilding the ancient city of Jerusalem according to Isaiah 58? Will other things happen to us? No, because we recognize that Isaiah is talking about images that are spiritual realities, not physical ones. In the same way, when we read about God creating a new heavens and a new earth, we should not think of eternity with a new place to live. Rather, if God is creating a new heavens and new earth, then everything is completely different. There has been a massive change that has occurred, and things are going to be so different that the heavens and earth are going to be considered new. And what that brings to mind is the Messianic age. Now, we're going to have to stop here for tonight and consider, but I want you to consider, we're not done with Isaiah 65 yet. I want us to think, how does Isaiah 65 bring us to the Messianic age? How could it be talking about that? And then, where we'll go after that is, how does the New Testament therefore use, when it talks about new heavens and new earth, how does it use the imagery that has been built up in Isaiah to teach us a lesson about heaven? Because the New Testament will use new heavens and new earth, not just to talk about the Messianic age, but to talk about something else as well. But we have to have a firm understanding of what the Hebrews would have understood about new heavens and new earth before we can ever understand what the New Testament is talking about. Any comments up to this point? It's a little deeper than maybe even Bill thought I was going to go into it, but it is an interesting topic to look at, because we do have to recognize that just because we read something in the Old Testament doesn't mean that it's always talking about the same thing in the New Testament, nor when we read of something in the Old Testament that the New Testament may expand on further about something different, does it mean that the Old Testament was literally talking about that as well. New heavens and new earth can mean one thing in Isaiah and mean something completely different in Revelation or when Peter uses it in 2 Peter. But it is based on what we understand about new heavens and new earth in the book of Isaiah, where it's first introduced to us.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor